A wise man once said that if you do not understand your role in the problem, it is difficult to be a part of the solution. It's certainly easy and even alluring to blame our circumstances or those around us, our boss, the weather, the elusive system that we live in that seems to be determined to ruin our life. Well, within the complexity of the universe and its infinite layers, it is simple to point the finger at anything other than ourselves. In 1917, H.L. Mencken wrote that for every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. A man after my own heart, who makes a very good point. Today, we're going to take a little tour into the inner workings of these mysterious systems around us and how they work and the leverage points within them that we can use to create different outcomes. From improving our habits and relationships to building better economies or completely changing the world. If we want to do this, we need to learn about some systems thinking to get there. So, hello to the Growth Mindset Psychology podcast, where we apply science to self-improvement and philosophize about what a life well lived means to us. Today, I am playing you an episode from my new show called How to Change the World, where I am examining the entire history of innovation in chronological order, from humans inventing fire all the way to the internet and TikTok. Hypothetically, at least, that is the plan. And in case that wasn't enough of a job, in between each of those history episodes, I'm breaking down a different mental model or theory that helps us think about how change happens. And so this episode that I'm about to play is on systems thinking, and it feels very applicable as well to you, my growth mindset audience, and I think you'll really enjoy it. So stay tuned. Every family seems to have their own set of unique yet universal problems. Even The Incredibles, a set of superheroes, manage to be completely relatable when they sit down for dinner. The youngest, Dash, is teasing his big sister Violet. Violet is rolling her eyes until one comment goes too far, and his dad stumbles in late, grumpy from work. Mum is busy stretching her arms across the table to keep the peace.
Violet, let go of your brother!
I'm intervening!
Of course, nobody wants chaos, but the system of siblings, stress, and unspoken rules seems to guarantee it every time. It's a system at work. And perhaps the same thing happens in your own family as you sit down. Now, let us rewind 2,000 years to another dinner table, the Last Supper, a group of friends breaking bread together, but under the surface there are feedback loops of loyalty, fear, and betrayal. One person's choice, Judas's loss of faith, has rippled outwards. It goes beyond just shaking their friendship and dinner conversation and impacts the course of history, religion, and the fate of entire civilizations. We've covered some very different dinner tables, but the same truth holds. When people come together, they create systems producing outcomes that no one planned, from amusing accidents to catastrophic, and sometimes world-changing. And that is the heart of systems thinking, learning to see the invisible patterns shaping our lives, from interactions around the dinner table all the way to the destiny of societies and the world. Welcome to How to Change the World, where we are studying the history and future of innovation and creating a blueprint for world changing. If you are just joining us, we are traveling through history chronologically to see how the modern world was made, and along the way, in episodes like this one, I pull out timeless lessons on how change really happens. Today, we are learning about systems thinking, one of the meta theories of everything that can change the way you look at, well, quite literally everything. With it, instead of blaming external events or fighting surface problems, we can start to investigate the internal nature of systems that create the outcomes that we want to change. For example, if you destroy a factory but not the demand that created it, soon enough there will be a new factory to replace it. Or how many revolutions have removed a corrupt leader to end up with a new set of corrupt leaders with the same problems? Well, by understanding the systems around us, we can find and pull on the levers needed to solve our toughest problems. This is certainly a major source of hope for me. So in this episode, we will be exploring the idea that the world is not some scary, infested dumpster destined to get worse, even if that's what the news tells you. In fact, we can rethink challenges and imagine new possibilities. And with that, we can ask, what is a system? A system is a set of interconnected components working together towards a common purpose, thus producing behavior over time. Now, I'll unpack what that means. Firstly, components of a system could be physical things like ants in a colony, or processes like a river flowing, or even ideas just like the rules in a game. And systems range from the tiny, like atoms, to the vast, like the entire universe. Systems can be living beings such as you and me, and abstract constructs like the Billboard Top 100. A fascinating thing about them is that they display emergence, where they create something beyond the sum of their parts. So if you think of the Beatles, for example, John, Paul, George and Ringo, together their collaboration created something more than just four blokes. This band, or system for making music, went on to change other systems in the world such as culture and fashion.
They think your haircuts are un-American.
Well, it was very observant of them, because we aren't American, actually.
True, that. True.
They even went on to change the global opinions of men from Liverpool.
Have you ever been this crazy about any other entertainer?
No, and that's what's so amazing. We don't know why we're like this.
Now, before we get carried away with Beatles trivia or thinking that everything is a system, we'll find that something like a pile of bricks or a shopping list is not a system and is just a static collection. They don't actively change or respond as a group when something is altered. So if you remove some sand from a pile, it doesn't change its behavior, whereas a system, on the other hand, is reactive. They will respond to changes in their parts. So if you remove a beetle from the band, if you change the temperature on a thermostat, or if you stop the moon orbiting the Earth, well, everything else left in that system will start to behave differently.
John, there's a rumour in the news of the Beatles paper that you might be leaving the group.
Rubbish. I'm
Absolute
contracted. Been trying to get out for years.
It's important to realize that systems are all around us, from the ecosystems in nature and the economies of our countries to the cells and organs of our bodies. When we see the world as systems, that helps us understand the invisible patterns that do shape everything that we experience. I find it slightly ironic that the conspiracy theorist who says, "It's all the system, man," is actually right, but perhaps not for the reasons they think. We are not surrounded by hidden forces guided by the evil hand of someone who seems to have it in for us, but we are surrounded by hidden forces that most of us simply don't bother to put our big brain pants on and get to the bottom of. And that is exactly what this episode is for, to help you see the wonderful nature of reality more clearly. So we'll go through the episode in 3 stages. Firstly, I'll outline the 4 basic components of systems with relatively simple examples. Secondly, we'll investigate how we can manipulate systems and create desirable and undesirable outcomes. And then finally, armed with our theory and practical examples, we'll plunge headfirst into some of the world's most difficult problems and see how they get created. So the first of the 4 elements of systems is stocks and flows. A stock is the amount of something there is, like the stocks of fish in the sea. But it could also be the volume of water in a reservoir or the amount of money in your bank account. They are things that go up and down over time in response to changes. Picture yourself stepping on the scales after a holiday. The number staring back at you isn't just yesterday's pizza, it's the accumulated memory of every meal, every walk, every late night snack over weeks or months. And your total body mass is actually what we call a stock. Weight changes slowly because our bodies have inertia. Flows, like the calories in and the energy out, move quite fast, but the total stock of your body mass takes time to adjust. Thus, it's impossible to gain or lose 10 pounds overnight. That might feel frustrating when you're trying to lose weight, but it's also a blessing, because imagine gaining 10 pounds after eating just 1 cheesecake. So stocks don't just keep us steady. In fact, they provide the stability we need for society to exist. Some take years to change, like the water in glaciers or the global population. Other stocks change almost instantly, such as the contents of the home feed on a social media app. Of course, being humans, we often find ourselves trying to control different levels of things around us, such as wondering whether to have another cup of coffee to maintain the optimum stock of caffeine levels in your blood. Well, this leads us to the topic of feedback loops. Do you ever feel the urge to keep your house warm over winter, but not too warm? Well, you might have a thermostat. If the house gets too cold, the thermostat will put the heating on. Once the room gets warm enough, the thermostat will switch the heating off. If you open a window, the heat drains faster and so the heating will crank higher. And this is all a very simple balancing loop designed to keep temperature stable. This is called a balancing feedback loop, and you'll see them everywhere. Uber has surge pricing in response to demand. In fact, in our last episode, we spoke about shame in our ancestors, and that was an internal feedback mechanism to prevent members of a tribe from being too antisocial. However, you might ask, how do these loops decide whether to calm things down or crank them up? And what happens if we get stuck in a loop that only grows louder and wilder? Well, one of those would be called a reinforcing feedback loop, such as how a gambling loss can snowball into someone losing everything, or how a virus infection in one person goes on to infect 2 more people and can spread across an entire population. Think about that moment when you check your phone just one more time and suddenly an hour has gone. Well, that is a classic reinforcing feedback loop, one tiny action that spirals into a time sink. These reinforcing feedback loops create exponential growth or catastrophic decline, and they are all over nature and our history once you start looking. The good news, though, is that they can be the source of problems and solutions. Let's say you plant monocultures that decreases soil and insect health, making it harder for other plants to grow, creating further degradation until the land becomes unusable. But doing the opposite, planting varied species increases soil health, which goes on to encourage diverse, healthy plant life and better soil, and so on. As we are on the topic of fixing things, have you ever fixed a problem only to find out it come back worse later? Well, what if that is due to some unseen delays lurking in the system? Delays are the secret ingredient that makes systems very tricky and sometimes frustrating. Imagine you are a Roman engineer having built an aqueduct across mountain ranges all the way to the city. You open a channel and it could take hours, sometimes days, for the water to finally reach the drinking fountains. So you perhaps open some more channels and, whoops, you have flooded the town baths. Of course, you hastily close many of the channels, and a few days later you face dry wells and no one has anything to drink. What a disaster. Delays can make balancing things tricky. And it turns out modern life is no different. Energy grids must balance demand and supply in real time, but power stations can't ramp up instantly. Or car factories, they have to plan months ahead and they risk shortages if they don't order enough, or overflowing warehouses if they get too high. So these delays make systems feel unpredictable, where you can fix one thing but the consequences show up much later and often in surprising ways. This leads us to the final main idea, which is boundaries. Boundaries shape everything in systems thinking. Many big mistakes happen in the world because we've drawn the map too narrowly or too wide. If you can remember what we learned in the fire episode about forest fires, for years we saw them as disasters to be stamped out. But when scientists expounded the boundary to include lightning strikes, animal migrations, and the long-term health of the forest, then a hidden truth appeared. Those small, regular fires, they clear dead wood, nourish the soil, and they make way for new life. So drawing the boundary too tightly and suppressing all fires only builds up fuel for a bigger catastrophe. The same boundary problem confuses medicine, business, or climate. Doctors who treat only the symptoms might miss the bigger lifestyle patterns that cause them. Politicians tinkering with a single tax policy might ignore the knock-on effects that show up far outside of a 4-year term. However, if we zoom out too much, we can risk drowning in data. Investors who are given more information about a company often can perform worse than those given just the critical metrics to monitor. So the lesson is that the right boundary is seldom the most obvious one, it's just never the same for every problem. Donella Meadows put it beautifully when she said, "The river doesn't care where you draw your city limits, the atmosphere doesn't respect national borders, and systems thinking means constantly asking, have I drawn the boundary correctly to capture what is really happening?" Now, with the basics covered, we are ready to start thinking about how we can manage systems. Underlying every transformation in history, from the rise and fall of empires to revolutions in technology, change is rarely about brute force or scale. Instead, it's about subtle shifts in the right places called leverage points. If you ever fight against a system, you can pour in money, write new policies, hire more people, and yet the mess stays the same or gets worse. Systems are stubborn creatures. But if you become a systems thinker, you learn to start spotting the magical places inside a system where a tiny tug can move mountains. In judo, you learn to use the momentum of an opponent's force against them. Leverage points in systems let us harness the behavior of a system for our own purposes. Let's say you put a smart energy meter in someone's kitchen or hallway, and you'll see the household energy on average go down by 30%. Simply planting hedgerows preserves habitats for bees and butterflies, which helps crop yields. So little actions can have a big effect. And central banks, for example, do this on a massive scale. In every country, central banks will gather a few times a year and tweak the interest rate in their country by 1/4 or 0.5%. That tiny change will set off ripples all over their economy. A reduction in the interest rate makes borrowing cheaper, so houses sell faster and prices rise. That means people can borrow against their homes and buy more stuff, whilst businesses can be investing in growth, all firing up a feedback loop that lifts the economy. Now, raising interest rates has the opposite effect, which helps to cool spending and cool inflation. But of course, there are delays to think about. It takes months for these changes to fully work their way through the system. The Fed, for example, will have to wait to see if it overdid it or underdid it. And then the data they use to make decisions, such as jobs and borrowing, is always messy, it's always delayed, and it's sometimes even wrong. This means they can often overshoot what they want to correct and find themselves in a waiting game if they try to calm the maddening roller coaster of the economy. Of course, the impact of one country's policies doesn't stop at the border of one country. Money and trade flows globally. The impact of interest rates in America or China reverberate across the whole world. Besides economics, nature also has plenty of leverage stories, such as the wolves of Yellowstone National Park. In 1995, 31 wolves were returned to the park that spread over 2 million acres. This small pack triggered a top-down transformation that restructured the entire landscape. Deer started shifting their grazing patterns to avoid wolf territory, letting many plants regrow and riverbanks stabilize, allowing songbirds to return and small mammals. One of those small mammals was of course the beaver, which makes dams, which in turn increases biodiversity and reduces flooding. So that one single original change cascaded up and down the food web, transforming the whole ecosystem from just a handful of wolves. Now, what do these stories teach us? Leverage points lie where flows and feedback loops and boundaries cross paths. These subtle pressure points are where a small, well-placed nudge unlocks the giant gears of complexity. Alright, we will be back in a second after a few adverts. We do have a premium membership if you want to support the show and skip the adverts for just a few dollars a month. Links are in the description if you're interested. Otherwise, I'll see you on the other side. Now, before we get too excited with our newfound systems powers and start trying to change everything willy-nilly, it's worth looking further into how systems surprise us. The butterfly effect theory is based on the idea that the flap of a butterfly's wings in Brazil could set off a tornado in Texas. I know that might sound a bit extreme, but the idea was proposed in 1961 by MIT meteorologist Edward Lorenz, who was running weather simulations. Impatient to get his results, he made a seemingly trivial decision. He slightly rounded one input number from 0.506127 to 0.506, which is a change so small it seemed almost meaningless. Literally 1/2000th of a change. But when he returned from his coffee break, the first day's weather had a few small changes in it, but every few days into the projection, these changes were doubling until a whole month later, the weather forecast was completely different. This is why systems often surprise us. Unlike the predictable mechanics of a clock, where one thing linearly impacts another, complex systems are non-linear. Small actions can amplify microscopic changes into massive transformations somewhere else. And this isn't just about weather and butterflies. It's how pretty much everything complicated works. Throughout history, humans invented stuff first, then spent ages cleaning up the messes that they didn't see coming. Take our ancestors chasing mammoths and giant sloths. It seemed like a good idea until they wiped out 80% of the large mammals on the planet. In the process, they wrecked entire ecosystems completely by accident, and they didn't see it coming in the slightest. This is actually a story we'll be learning about in the next episodes as we dive into the inventions of weapons. A different invention we'll see much later in the show, way up in the modern times of 230 BC in the Qin dynasty, their first attempt at a surveillance state. Advancements in record keeping at the time were very exciting, helping enforce laws and taxes across what was the biggest empire that had ever existed in that region before then. Awkwardly, however, each new decree demanded more administration, more oversight, and harsher enforcement, which amplified fragility in the system. Citizens grew resentful, officials became overwhelmed, and the empire collapsed after just 14 years. Sadly, the first great empire of China was also the shortest, showing us how well-intentioned advancements can create self-destructive feedback loops. Today, we're witnessing this pattern with our latest inventions. Social media platforms and smartphones were created to connect people and democratize information. Instead, years later, we are beginning to see how they fragment attention, impact our mental health, and supercharge extremism and make truth itself even more elusive. They weren't intentionally designed for this, but within their own system that use leverage points to optimize for engagement, these issues happen to be the long-term unexpected outputs. Something we will see time and again is how innovations grow into forces that reshape society in ways their inventors could hardly imagine. The butterfly effect is thus an invitation to humility. Systems thinking offers tools, but never guarantees. The future isn't just shaped by grand strategies, but by the reverberance of small, sometimes unnoticed choices. Before we explore some of the biggest systems affecting humans today, I have a few more ideas around how systems survive and make progress that should help complete the picture of what is really going on. Whether you think of cells or cities, systems share a deep pattern that underpins both survival and progress. The first secret of enduring systems is resilience and the ability to bounce back from disruption. Even if I look at my own body, it's easy to spot. A cut on my finger will heal and slowly vanish. A grievous dose of man flu will eventually be fought off, and even my various broken bones have all reset. The body doesn't just heal, it's full of countless hidden feedback loops that keep things like temperature and blood sugar stable, and even your mood gets regulated. If we look at other parts of nature, resilience lets forests regenerate after fires or floods, not instantly or perfectly, but reliably thanks to webs of checks and balances. And history shows us what happens when this resilience is stripped away. I've already mentioned that intensive farming can push land past its ability to recover. Well, after the invention of the automobile and tractors, land across America was intensively farmed and quickly destabilized and lost its resilience to drought, leading to the American Dust Bowl of the 1930s, where over 100 million acres of land became a giant wasteland spreading over 5 different states of America. Meanwhile, the stock market crashed in 1929, in some part due to the job displacement by technology, and of course leveraged over-speculation, pushing banks past their resilience points, which triggered bank failures across the country. Of course, there were other systems at play across the entire world, but the Great Depression of America that lasted an entire decade is a striking representation of the convergence between different systems in technology, economics, global politics, and nature having amplifying effects on each other to create what became the worst economic disaster of American history. If you've never heard of the American Dust Bowl, it's worth looking at a photo because it does look like something out of a sci-fi film like Mad Max or Dune. Although it must have been scary at the time and very hard to live through, it didn't last forever. Which brings us to the idea of self-organization. Complex systems really astonish us with their emergent order. There is no conductor to instruct a snowflake how to crystallize. Their order arises from countless local interactions governed by simple rules. The same miracle made you. You started as a single fertilized egg cell and multiplied and diversified, evolving from a jelly-like blob to a fully formed infant with organs, limbs, memory, and will. Then, of course, societies, they self-organize too. Humanity didn't start with a grand blueprint for industrial civilization. Instead, people experimented, borrowed, tinkered, from building houses and farming to learning to burn coal, pump water, build railroads, invent skyscrapers. Each innovation flowing from and feeding back into the community as a whole. Culture, language, technology are all products of distributed learning and ceaseless adaptation. So this podcast is, in a sense, the study of how self-organization across time and technologies has propelled human evolution to where we are today. After all, history itself is a record of the emergent patterns as societies and technologies build upon themselves. Which leads us into the final idea of hierarchies. With all these intricate feedback mechanisms and butterflies causing tornadoes, why doesn't everything collapse under the weight of this chaos? Well, systems sort complexity by organizing into levels, so subsystems inside supersystems. There's a really nice fable of two watchmakers for an example here. Both individuals were very skilled and found themselves in high demand for their ability to make glorious watches out of thousands of intricate parts. One watchmaker built his watches by assembling each tiny part in sequence one by one, whilst the other built small modules of 10 or so parts of springs, faces, gears, which would then fit into bigger modules of 100 parts with 10 submodules into it, and eventually these will be joined into one complete watch. Well, whenever the first watchmaker was distracted by a customer or a call of nature, his entire work was lost and he would have to start again from the very first part. But the second watchmaker never lost more than a few minutes of work and he could handle any distraction, picking up wherever he left off. Nature does much the same thing. The human body has a respiratory system or a digestive system, which is made up of separate organs, which are themselves made of different tissues, which are made of cells, which are made of molecules. Each layer is resilient in itself, but also an essential subpart of the whole thing. And any organism, living or abstract, needs hierarchy to function. Society itself even works this way. We have families, teams, businesses, towns, cities, and nations. So for progress, well-crafted hierarchies allow innovations to spread quickly without shattering the larger structure. And when a system has resilience, it allows us to build more advancements on top of that system. Just as learning to build better foundations allows us to build a skyscraper, learning to build robust and deep systems of technology and society allows more innovations on top of us that can build our future. That's why studying the sweep of innovation from the taming of fire to quantum computing is ultimately about uncovering the hidden logic behind how the world adapts, recovers, and transforms. So again, I think we end up with some of the thesis behind this podcast as we see the real challenge come into focus. The one that we'll be chasing episode after episode, which is to learn from these patterns so that we can build a world that's not only more ingenious, but also more robust and wiser. After all, if history is the story of human systems, then systems thinking is our best map for how to truly and sustainably change the world. Now, looking forwards from problems of today, systems fool us as presenting themselves as a series of events. Daily news and ordinary conversation is full of specific events. A team wins, a river floods, a business booms. These events are all outputs, moment by moment, from the black box of a system. An assassination, a terrible crash, a stunning victory. These can all hook our emotions, even though we see many of them fill our screens repeatedly day by day. But they feel different enough to keep us fascinated whilst offering very little explanatory value behind them. If you want to understand the news, you have to research far beyond a recent event and its accompanying simple explanation to understand the underlying structures that create these problems. Knowing that, of course, we can look at the problems of today a little differently. Consider how we measure national success. In the 2000s, Hungary's GDP grew. Alrighty, thanks for listening so far. If you want to hear the final section of this episode, where we learn about the inner workings of systems today, from GDP and population dynamics to politics and global initiatives that actually do change the world, or the fact that literally every human thing that feels real and important, like money, nations, and democratic systems, are entirely made-up systems designed by people just like you and me, with new rules rewritten in each era to meet the problems of their day. Well, to dive into that, you'll need to find my new show called How to Change the World, wherever you get your podcasts. I hope you learned something new and are excited to think about how systems apply in your life, and may be excited to subscribe, which would be a big help whilst I'm growing the show. As always, you can grab a call with me on Wednesday afternoons completely for free because I enjoy talking to people. Alternatively, a good rating or review is extremely helpful for me, or sharing this episode with a friend who has terrible systems. I'm sure you know the type, the sort of person who can't turn up on time. Maybe every time they try to improve something in their life, they just make it worse, or perhaps they're convinced that watching more TikTok videos will solve the bad smell in the fridge. Yeah, we know the person. But seriously though, sharing the podcast is very helpful. And with that, it's worth remembering that complex systems aren't personal failings or single villains. They are patterns produced by systems doing what they do. Yes, it alters the system, man. But that doesn't mean that nothing can be done about it. It means that we can literally solve anything by designing for long-term outcomes with vision, patience, and open-minded optimism for the greater systems all around us. As William Blake said, to see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower. Hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. It's a wonderful time to be alive, so enjoy the beauty of everything in its wonderful complexity. Thank you so much for listening.
Go you!
Your consistency to reach the end of an episode is legendary.
My hero!
If you have any ideas or feedback for the show, I'm always interested to hear from you.
You're the best!
Studies show we need time for information to sink in, so I'm going to give you a 5-second pause. Silence. To reflect on one idea from the show before you jump back into your busy life. Ready and go.